So today we're going to talk about a very brave woman by the name of Judith who protected another city that was under attack from the Assyrians. This was not Jerusalem, okay? But the Assyrians had attacked another city in Judah, and they had surrounded it. And basically what they were going to do was they were, it was called sieging. They had the city under siege. And there's different methods of siege warfare. There's methods where you build yourself up slowly closer and closer to the city walls. And sometimes a siege just means you just sit there and wait it out. Maybe you shoot some arrows and throw some, catapult some rocks in and do some different things like that. But basically, if you have the city surrounded, no one can get in or out. Unless the city has an unlimited food and water supply on the inside, eventually the people inside are going to starve to death and have to give up otherwise. Okay, they might be protected behind the city walls, but they can't stay there forever. And it saves your army from going through a battle and maybe losing your soldiers. Well, that's what the Assyrians had decided to do. Okay, and the Assyrian general was a very famous general who was leading his men, and they encamped all around the outside of the city. And things were beginning to look more and more desperate for the Israelites who were inside the city. And the leading men of the city got together, and they said they're ready to surrender. The men all thought, oh, we're done, there's nothing we can do, we just need to surrender and give the city up. But Judith, who was a very pious widow, stood up and she chastised them and she said, you are committing a very great sin. Okay? You aren't trusting in God. Do you remember what the prophets have told us time and time again? It's not through our own strength that we are saved, but it is through strength in our belief in God. Go fight. Consecrate yourselves to God and go fight. But the men weren't having any of that. So Judith said, well, do penance at least right now and wait a few days. So they were kind of embarrassed that a woman had gotten up and told them that they were basically cowards. But they decided it would be best to do what she said. But Judith had a plan in mind. She wasn't planning just to sit back and pray. She was going to do what the men weren't going to do. She was going to take action. She had a belief in God. So she fasts and she prays. And then she asks God to make her strong. She puts her faith in God just like she told those men they were supposed to. She asks God to make her strong. And then she gets dressed in her finest clothes. She puts on her makeup. And she's a very beautiful woman. And she takes one of her maids and she slips outside of the city walls. So Judith fasts and prays. Asks God to make her strong. And then dresses in her best clothes and goes outside city walls. And she goes over to the encampment of the Assyrians and she says, the men inside are all cowards and I've come over to your camp. And so they bring her to the general of the Assyrians, and he is captivated by her beauty. And he says, welcome, welcome, please come in. And he gives her a tent, and he allows her to come and go as she wishes, and she stays in the Assyrian camp. And a few nights later, the Assyrians have a huge feast. Okay? So, she's loud, stay in the Assyrian camp. Then they have a great feast one night. And the Syrians are so assured of their victory and the fact that they have these superior numbers that they are totally off their guard. And they drink and they drink and they drink. Including the general. They all drink too much wine and they all fall into a deep sleep. The general goes back and he's asleep in his tent. Yes? So after what? And dresses. And dresses in her best clothes. So they drink too much wine. And sleep. So Judith then slips into the general's tent. She takes his sword and cuts his head off. She takes his head, she picks it up, she puts it inside a bag and closes the bag up. And her maiden flee. They return to Jerusalem. I'm sorry, not to Jerusalem. They return to their city. And they get inside, and she calls all the men together. All the leading men of the city. And she says, "You must fight now. Gather together, prepare. Get your swords and your shields. Put on your armor. Gird your loins." And then she pulls out the head and holds it up. And she says, "First thing in the morning at dawn, you must attack." And they do. The Israelites attack at dawn. They open the city gates and flood out. And now, all the Assyrians had feasted the night before and had too much to drink and they were all groggy. Now they're under attack. They're in a panic and they go in to wake up the general and they find the general there with no head. And they panic. And they flee and they go into disarray. And the Israelites flood to the camp and they're trying to run away. And the Israelites rout the great Assyrian army. Send it packing all the way back to Assyria, and they obtain a great victory because of the faith of one woman, Judith. Now, back in Jerusalem and in the kingdom in general after the great victories of Judith and of the victory at Jerusalem of the angel of God being sent to King Hezekiah, the kingdom of Judah again falls into idolatry. Some years later, they fall away from God again. And God again sends another great prophet, Jeremias. So we had Isaiah, now the prophet that is sent is Jeremias. But not only is the prophet Jeremias sent, God also gives the people a very pious king named Uzziah. Together, They drive the false worship out of Judah. However, the people, even though the king and the prophet got rid of the false idol worship, the people did not turn away from their sins. They were still marrying pagan women and committing other impurities and other types of sins, and so the people did not want to turn away from their sins, and Jeremias warned them. Okay? He warned them about that. He said, you need to not be doing these things. You need to be following the commands of God. If you don't, okay, his warning was that the people will be made captives and Jerusalem destroyed. And he warned them and he warned them. And then, unfortunately, King Jeremias dies. And the kings that come after him follow the example of the people. They're different varying levels of, some of them are more holy than others. But the people continue to sin, and eventually there's only 4 more kings. Now, we've only talked about a certain amount of kings. That may seem like a lot. But over the period of time of the split in the kingdom of Israel, there was dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of kings who ruled. Okay, we talk about some of the most important ones, either because they were important from the fact that they were very sinful, and God used them as examples of how not to be, and how the people needed to repent, or they were holy and brought the people back to God. Only 4 more kings, and each ruled for a very short time. Okay, after Jeremias, before the sins of the people overtake each of the kings, these 4 wicked kings, and the kingdom of Judah is captured by the Babylonians. Now, how short were the reigns of these 4 kings? Well, Jeremias was still alive at the time of the capture of Jerusalem. And during that whole time, he kept warning the people. He kept warning the people. Return to God, stop sinning, and they didn't. And Jeremias, when the city was under attack, took the Ark of the Covenant out of the temple and went and hid it outside of the city. So that way it would not be captured by the Babylonians. Because he knew, he had prophesied that the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed and taken. They took the ark outside of the city walls, and he hid it, okay, to protect it. Not only did the Israelites lose to the Babylonians and were captured by the Babylonians, but they sided at the time with the Egyptians. So once again, they made the same mistake. Didn't we talk about this already? Remember, in the kingdom of Judah? The kingdom of Judah sided with the Assyrians against the Egyptians. And God said, don't do that. Don't align yourselves with pagan peoples. And they did it anyway. And God punished them for it. Here again, this time they aligned themselves with the Egyptians. And the Egyptians lose. The Israelites lose to the Babylonians. And the Babylonians capture Jerusalem. But not only do they capture Jerusalem, they absolutely destroy the city. The city, the temple, is all destroyed. The walls, everything. Okay? And we're going to talk about this era next. It is known as the Babylonian captivity. And it will last for 70 years. Okay? The kingdom of the Assyrians was starting to wane in power. There were times throughout history when the Assyrians would come to power and the Babylonians, the power would shift. The Babylonians were coming into power now. The Babylonians were able to defeat the Egyptians and defeat the kingdom of Judah. Unlike, however, the kingdom of Israel, which never again was to return, the kingdom of Judah will. That's why we talk about the Babylonian captivity being for 70 years, because the Israelites, some of them being from the kingdom of Israel, but most of them from the kingdom of Judah, will return to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity, rebuild the city after returning to God. So we're going to talk next about the 70-year period and some of the prophets that God sent to the Israelites to bring them back to Him during those 70 years. Yes?
Jeremias captured?
He was not. He was not. Some of the Lamentations of one of the books in the Bible, which were written, or at least they were said by Jeremias, was when he was left in the city after most of the people had been taken away. Not every single person was taken away, but most of the Israelites were. He was not one of them, though. Maybe he was off with the ark at the time, hiding it when they carted off most of the people. Plus, he would have been older at that point and may have just felt he wasn't worth taking as a slave, because they would have wanted the younger people who could work as slaves. In fact, they think that, remember, interestingly enough, the Jews helped to build the pyramids in Egypt when they were enslaved, right? And those are considered some of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. Well, another one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And pretty sure that it was the Jewish slaves who helped to build those. So the Israelites, twice when they were enslaved, helped to build some of the most amazing works of architecture and all of history, which just shows how magnificent the Temple of Solomon must have been, because they built that for themselves. They were very, very good workmen, very gifted in these areas, and so they would be put to work, and they were considered to be valuable because of that. So during that 70-year period, which we're going to study next, they were enslaved by the Babylonians, and they come back to God, which was a good thing. And then we'll eventually, after the reign of the Babylonians ends, they will return, at least some of them will return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple.